Hey folks, I'm Jack Fossett, and welcome to this demo review and tone tips video for the amplifier that you see everywhere, the modern classic, the Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. We're going to get started with a couple of my favorite tones here in just a minute. Before so, please click on the link below and listen to some music. If you hear a tune that you like, please download it or buy a CD. Let's get going with some of those tones now. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy it. So the Hot Rod Deluxe. Before we get too into this, I do want to mention the one that I'm playing today is a Hot Rod Deluxe 3. Some of you might have been able to tell that from the matte black amp top that they changed from a chrome one, which could be kind of hard to see what your settings were and things. And there have been different iterations of the Hot Rod Deluxe over the years. Any of the tone tips or review parts that I mention are going to be applicable to pretty much all the models, just maybe with a little bit of tweaking. But to be honest, all of us use different guitars in different settings, different sort of contexts. We have different playing styles that suit different things. So any of the tips that I mentioned, think of them as a starting point for you as opposed to kind of a definitive. Just think of it as a way to, kind of get to a cool tone and then maybe need to dial it in a little bit differently from there. So let's dive in now regarding this amplifier. Now, first tip. And also, for those of you who have watched some of my tone tip videos for the Hot Rod DeVille and for the Blues Deluxe, apologies in advance because actually a lot of these tips are going to be the same. With a lot of amplifiers, tube amplifiers in this price range, one of the things that I look for is how much usable tone is there within the EQ. And really good amps probably have more flexible range on the EQ knobs, but in order to get a good consumer amp to you at a price that people can afford, they're not going to use top components. Now, I'm not saying this is a criticism. This is kind of just what it is. These amplifiers are not terribly expensive when it comes to tube amplifiers, and they're designed to be workhorse gigging amps. Not that they can't be used for other things. I, have recorded with them before. I've used Hot Rod Deluxes for years, and I know other people who've recorded with them. They can be great if you know how to dial them in. But they're going to be more based on finding a sweet spot than another amp where you might have kind of a little bit more range on what to do. So one of the things with an amp like this, first of all, I wouldn't be afraid to turn the EQ down more than you expect. For instance, this is actually a pretty bassy amplifier, and it's also a very strident amplifier. It kind of has this, really, it has some intensity on either range. It actually can have some intensity in the mid-range too. So, for instance, you really don't need a lot of bass, and treble, you really just want to get up to a point where it's clear, where you're cutting through the mix, and any more than that, and it's going to start to sound harsh and get some harsh overtones. But it's easy to just kind of dial that back to where you need it. The other important thing, and this is one of the things I want to mention is one of the biggest tips for these amps, is to use the low gain input. There's a number 1 input and a number 2 input. The number 2 input is low gain. Well, not only is it lower gain, but it's a little bit of a saggier tone. It's got a little bit more roundness to the tone, whereas the primary input's a little aggressive. It's a little like, hey man, we're at the gig and it's time to rock. And the number 2 is, it's kind of like, yeah, well, before we play, we're going to listen to some Paul Simon records in the green room. Come on. It's just more pleasant when you listen to it in the low gain input, and this amp is so aggressive and powerful that I don't think you really lose anything. It doesn't sound weak when you go into the low gain input. It just sounds a little bit, you can sink into your notes a little bit more. It doesn't have quite those spiky, harsh frequencies. So here's an example with a clean tone that I particularly like, playing first into the high gain input, and then I'm going to switch into the low gain input so that you can hear the difference back to back. Now, on the subject of harsh frequencies, one of the other things about this amp is the reverb. Now, it's very easy to say, like, well, it's a Fender tube amp with real, spring reverb. It's got to be good, right? Because, Fender. And it is good, but one of the things about the reverb on this amp is it's very, very bright and splashy. It's very vintage sounding reverb. Now, that's not a bad thing. But what is interesting about it is it's not necessarily what I would expect a lot of people who are playing kind of more modern blues rock or rock and using these amps for that type of application. It's not a reverb that, in my opinion, really suits those genres. Now, before we talk about some other options, I do want to show you, because of it being a cool vintage sounding reverb, here are a couple of tones using both the Stratocaster and the Les Paul, and dialing the bass nearly out of the EQ and pushing a lot of reverb, and you can get some cool surfy tones or some cool vintage blues tones doing this trick with that kind of bright splashy reverb. So check out these two kind of cool vintage sounding tones, taking that reverb and really utilizing it for what its strong points are. Now I mentioned that's a cool sound, but a lot of people who are getting these amps are not going to be playing kind of going for a vintage blues sound or a surf sound, as cool as those tones can be. Again, a lot of these amps are used by more rockers, blues rockers, modern blues players in general, and that reverb might not quite suit that. So one of the things you can do, and this is what you heard and what I did there at the beginning with the Les Paul, is the preamp out and power amp in is your effects loop. So one of my favorite things to do is to use an alternate reverb with this amplifier and to run it into the effects loop. You can also run a delay into the effects loop. There's other stuff that you can do with that, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But now let's check out a tone similar using the Fender Stratocaster. I think ultimately, if you want to get the most out of a Hot Rod Deluxe, you need to look at it as a pedal platform amp. Because two things. Number one, I think the clean channel is way better than the drive channel. The drive channel is usable. You can get some cool tones out of the drive channel. But I think it responds better with pedals than it does use. I think you should look, and this is how I used to run it when I used to gig with a Hot Rod Deluxe. It was a really cool, it was called the White Lightning Edition, that had this Alpine white Tolex with this really cool kind of sparkly black grill cloth. It was a limited edition one with a Celestion speaker. And I used to gig with that amp and a Marshall BB2, the cheap one, the cheap blues breaker, the little kind of tone bug one. And I got a ton of compliments on my tone. You know, sometimes you don't need to look much further than a basic grab and go rig. But a big part of it was using the overdrive pedal into it as opposed to using the drive channel. And part of the reason for this is twofold. Number one, I think it just eats up pedals a little bit better anyway. But number two, the drive channel and the clean channel share an EQ. Well, that makes it a little bit tricky if you're going to be switching back and forth. Because I think in order to get the drive channel to sound better, you really need to dial back that EQ in a lot of ways to kind of avoid some of the harsh frequencies and to smooth out the gain a little bit. So like when I was using the Les Paul in that beginning clip and running the reverb and the delay into the effects loop, which by the way are a one-control Prussian blue reverb and a Keeley Eccos Delay. I was running those into the effects loop and using the more drive to get a real heavy grit. You notice that the EQ was backed off quite a bit to kind of round out and warm up the tone. Well, that works great if you're going for that kind of blues rocky tone with some pedals going into the effects loop. But then if I were to switch over to the clean channel, it wouldn't sound nearly as good. Conversely, if I then use the clean channel for a great tone, a really nice kind of crisp tone that has clear highs and just enough kind of bass to fill it out but without getting too boomy, if I were to click over to the drive channel, that EQ might not be that suited for a drive sound. So since they share an EQ, it can be tricky to switch back and forth to find a setting that really you get the most out of each. So I personally think that this amp works best as a pedal platform. So what I want to do next is play a clip where I'm going to use the drive channel and the amp's onboard reverb, and then I'm going to turn the reverb off, switch to the clean channel, kick on an Ibanez TS808 Tube Screamer, and kick on the Prussian blue reverb so that you can hear kind of the same thing played back to back, one on just the amp with its features, and then one using it more as a pedal platform. So here we go. Here's the Les Paul using the Tube Screamer going straight into the clean channel. Now, I should also mention, if you're going to do something kind of in the middle, one of the cool things is the more drive sounds pretty cool, and it can get rich, and it can get saturated, and it can get thick, and be a really nice kind of heavier lead tone. That's when it's more drive is kicked on, and it's the little red light. When it's the little yellow light, and it's just the basic drive channel, it sounds a little bit more crunchy, and I do think that channel can work pretty well as kind of an edge of breakup, so it's not really a heavy distorted, but kind of just a little bit of a bluesy grit to it, and then jump that with a pedal. So this is doing a combination of both. Now you can just kick up to the more drive channel, and it gives you a little bit of a boost, but again, a pedal gives you more flexibility. So here I'm gonna play the Les Paul and do the classic drive, and then to give myself a boost, I'm gonna kick the Tube Screamer on so that I'm pushing the drive channel to get even a more saturated tone. So the last thing I want to mention, now this is going back to the preamp out, power amp in. A lot of people nowadays are switching over to a lot of digital stuff. You know, for me personally, I'm getting into Line 6 gear. I've started using an HX Stomp and a Pod Go. These amps have been around for years. For a lot of people, they're kind of like your best friend for a long time. Been on the road with you, you know, played them forever, and you may not want to get rid of it, but you may find yourself not using it as much anymore, switching over to a digital market. Now, I know I'm going for a very specific kind of group of people here, so this might not affect everybody, but one of the things that you can do is with the power amp in, you can use this as a tube-powered cab for something like a digital processor. So at the end here, what I want to do is plug the Line 6 Pod Go into the power amp in. So I'm not getting any of the amp's character. I'm using it as a powered cabinet, a tube-powered cabinet, and using the Line 6 Pod Go to jump off of this so that it's a little bit more lifelike, it's a little bit more amp-like to be able to go into an actual amp and have it coming out of a speaker cabinet than for people, you know, who some people kind of miss that with the digital things as opposed to going into the PA and then hearing yourself through the monitor. And there are a lot of players I know who really like still having that kind of amp experience, even if it, you know, but it works really, really well for that. So here it is with the Line 6 Pod Go plugging into the power amp in and using it as a powered cab. Folks, thanks for tuning in. I hope that you found these tips helpful. I hope that it helps you get the most out of a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, whether you have one, whether you just use them occasionally on a backline, whether you don't have one, you may come across one. They're frequent in the used market. You see them being traded and sold and on backlines and all over the place. They're an amp that, whether or not you own one, it's a nice thing to know how to dial one in and how to get the most out of it if you find yourself in a situation where you need to use one. Now, this is not the end-all be-all of how to use a Hot Rod Deluxe. If you use it a different way, please feel free to let us know in the comments below. Let us know if you have one, if you use one. I'm Jack Fossett. Remember to visit those links below and listen to some music. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.